Welcome to Saturday's Warrior. This is part two of a video we did breaking down potential homes and outcomes for the ACC schools if and when that conference does implode. So we kind of game out by different scenarios where we think certain schools will go and how all the rest of the dominoes will fall after that. So if you haven't already, be sure to go check out part one of this video either before or after, either way. And also be sure to like and subscribe the video. It helps a lot. And last thing, I forgot. So in this video, you'll notice that the graphic that I'm looking at my screen kind of cut off at the top. So it looked kind of weird. I noticed that once I finished recording, I wasn't about to go back and re-record. So just deal with it. You still basically see everything you need to in it. Anyway, let's get to it. So this brings us to scenario number 2, which is the inverse of the first one, with the Big Ten taking Florida State and Clemson, and the SEC taking UNC and UVA. Now, other than UNC, which makes perfect sense for both of these conferences, these other three have reasons why either conference would and why they wouldn't want them. So the SEC, for example, Florida State and Clemson make a lot of sense there, but also there is that aforementioned gentleman's agreement in the conference not to add schools from their existing footprint. And also, in terms of expanding, it does allow them to add new brands, but it doesn't really branch them out into new geography. So it kind of depends on what their priorities are there. Now, UVA also seems like a great fit for the Big Ten in so many ways, but one of the big attractions for UVA is to get into that DMV area, which the Big Ten is already in with Maryland. So not that it would hurt, just that it's maybe less essential for the Big Ten in that regard. So let's see what this looks like. UVA, UNC, and then Florida State and Clemson to the SEC. Now, I think that the SEC, if they get UNC, would definitely want to add Duke as well, bringing that rivalry in and really strengthening their brand as a basketball conference. Obviously, they had 8 schools in to March Madness this year. We're in the middle of the second round right now, so the first round didn't go so well for them, so it couldn't hurt to bolster that, but definitely would put them up there on the level with the Big 12 in terms of basketball, really trying to strengthen that. And as I already mentioned, we're going to 20, so the Big 10 is tapped out there. And so they would need one other school, and where would they go? Looking at these again, doesn't really make sense. In this scenario, they're not expanding within their footprint, so that eliminates several of the more attractive programs, and they already have UNC and UVA, so Tech and NC State wouldn't be as necessary. So I think that in this scenario, only going to 20 schools, that the SEC would already be looking to go somewhere other than the ACC, which would take them to the Big 12. And I think they go after Kansas. As I mentioned, they want to make sure that it stays, they expand still more or less within their region, which Kansas does that, bordering Oklahoma and Missouri. It reunites that rivalry with Mizzou, and obviously we've been talking about basketball with the other 3 additions in this scenario. Kansas obviously does that and really strengthens the conference's brand as a basketball conference. Now, you could also say Louisville here would have done the same, but again, we're avoiding the same state, and I still think that Kansas's brand is even bigger. Now, getting them out of the Big 12 might be a little bit tougher, and so that might be an argument for some of these ACC schools. But I'm going to assume that there's enough money on the line, and we just, in this scenario, we're seeing the ACC fall apart, that where there's a will, there's a way. So one of the knocks against this scenario is that NC State and UNC would be separated, one of them moving on to a power conference and the other one not. So there are some questions as to whether this is even feasible. Maybe the SEC has to take UNC and NC State both together instead of Duke. So that is a slight variation on this. But I'm going to assume that, again, there's so much money on the line that eventually, since politics is holding it up, I think that they will find a way. If the ACC, if there is finally a way to get out of the ACC, I think they'll find a way to make it work. But we could see this whole thing shifted. Just imagine Duke and NC State swapped. Now, this is the only scenario in which I foresee the Big 12 being able to get all four of those schools that we always talk about, with Pitt, Louisville, Virginia Tech, NC State. Again, it could be switched with Duke, but let's say it is NC State, and the Big 12 gets those four, but it's also at the cost of potentially losing Kansas. And so the Big 12 would, in addition to adding those four schools to get to 20, they would have to replace Kansas, but fortunately, falling into their lap again would be Miami. So let's take a look at what these conferences would look like with this makeup. We have the Big Ten. This is really weird. And I mean, at this point, we just have to get over the fact that the Big Ten's geography doesn't make any sense. That for them, the top priority is collecting brands. And while Florida State and Clemson aren't AAU, I think they kind of set this precedent when they took Oregon. They still had a chance to take Stanford at that point, which would have fit more academically and still given them another travel partner for Washington. Not as close, but they're on the West Coast. But they went for Oregon, who's technically AAU, but not known for necessarily being the most academically rigorous of all schools out there. But they had the brand, and so they went with Oregon. And we know that Florida State is working tirelessly to get to AAU status, and I think at some point they will, and I think that they could fit in with the Big 12 in that regard, or Big 10, in that regard. Now, Clemson, I don't know if there's any chance that they get to the AAU level, but I think at this point, money talks, and Clemson would be a way for the Big Ten to continue to not only expand their footprint, not so much South Carolina specifically, but just there in the South with a big brand that is going to help them get more money from the playoff potentially down the road. So in that sense, we know that that's the Big Ten strategy, and that could make sense, even though they don't meet some of the other criteria that the Big Ten may have. Then we have the SEC, which geographically just looks way more cohesive and makes so much more sense. And then in terms of the schools that they've added to go along with your Kentucky, your Vanderbilt, your Tennessee, you're adding other powerhouses like Kansas, UNC, Duke, UVA. And so this is really shaping up to be a very strong basketball conference. And then you've got the Big 12. Losing Kansas, again, really hurts, but they've added some other solid programs to replace them, and definitely have built up in the East. So I think the Big 12 still comes out in pretty good shape in this scenario. But again, I think the other two conferences pulled even further ahead. All right, so what does this scenario 2 look like when the conferences expand to 24 teams each? And I think it would start out much the same. I think the SEC would go after Duke to bring along with UNC, and then they would turn to the Big 12 to fill out the rest of those spots. Now, there's still one more spot to reach 24 teams, and there are several teams that fit the bill. You could argue a Louisville, you could argue Miami, NC State, and you could even throw in a Texas Tech in there if they wanted to get even deeper into Texas. But I think that it would be Virginia Tech, at least for the sake of this scenario. Anything's possible, but I put Tech because it's a school that the SEC's flirted with in the past, and also they bring in a rivalry with UVA, with West Virginia, and even Tennessee. And so there's a lot of rivalry there, and it fits geographically as well. The Big Ten, on the other hand, I think, as we pointed out in the other one, that Notre Dame might feel the pressure when the conferences are getting this big to feel like, okay, now we have to join. And along with them, the Big Ten could bring another school in Florida to really strengthen their foothold in the state, but then also another rival with Notre Dame to add to the many with Michigan and Purdue and now USC, all their rivals that are already existing in the conference. And speaking of Notre Dame rivals, I think the Big Ten could go after Stanford, and Stanford would want their travel partner Cal. And so that would really give Notre Dame all the reasons to come join them in the conference, making it that much easier for them to swallow that bitter pill of abandoning independence. So let's take a look at what these versions of the conferences would look like. Again, the Big Ten all over the place, and then the SEC, much like the other scenario. And then we've got the Big 12. I don't really want to keep looking at this, so we will just move on to the third scenario. We know that the big prizes from the ACC are Florida State and UNC, and everybody's waiting to see that if the ACC falls apart, where these guys will end up, and that'll impact the rest of the dominoes. And so far, we've looked at these common scenarios of both of them having travel partners, Florida State with Clemson, UNC with UVA, but it doesn't have to be that way. What if one of these power conferences was able to bag both of these schools? And so that's what we're going to explore in this third scenario. So looking at it, the SEC, I think if they were to get UNC, I don't think that their next move would be Florida State. So I'm going to assume that if one of the conferences is able to get both of these, I think it would be the Big Ten. And they've been much more aggressive, I think, in terms of expansion too. And yes, the SEC expanded with Texas and OU first, but I think the Big Ten has shown more appetite and desire for it. So I could see them swooping up and getting both of these. And we also know that Florida State may not want to go to the SEC. And so with Florida State joining the Big Ten, maybe that's enough for UNC to say, you know what, we want to go there too. And that causes the rest of this scenario to take place. So I think this is how it would start. And then the SEC would go after these same remaining brands. Again, get into North Carolina and get a Duke to kind of help offset the Tar Heels there. And then they would take the next biggest brand, Clemson. Now, you could argue, well, maybe they wouldn't want to stay within the footprint and they go outside it. Yes, that's true. So there are several other programs they could go for. But in this one, I'm going to say that with the Big Ten racking up that many brands, that there'd be pressure for the SEC to maybe get those bigger brands. There's also some arguments that Clemson may not be that big of a brand as their football continues to decline, and they may go back to how they were, what was it? Probably 15. I don't know. When did they get good time? Time has no meaning to me anymore, but maybe 20 years ago, before they started rattling off all those championships. But in this case, the Big 12, ends up getting Miami in their lap again. There are several scenarios where this happens. A lot of people from the Big 12 don't really want a Miami. They think they could be like a Texas, and in some ways they might be, but I don't think they would have that same clout and that same sway. And the Big 12 has already shown that they're willing to take members that aren't completely thrilled about being there. And I'm not going to name any names, just those schools up north. But, I think without a doubt, Brett Yormark goes and swoops up Miami if they become available. Then again, we see the Pitt and Louisville combos. And UVA seems like one that's getting left in the dust here, but I don't know if it's a great fit, much like Stanford and Cal. So I wonder if UVA either refuses to go to the Big 12, if they even have conversations, or the Big 12 says, you know what, they're not really a great fit for what we want. And at that point, the Big 12 has some options, but I think Georgia Tech would make the most sense just in the terms of getting into Atlanta and then having another school there geographically to fit in with the conference. So again, let's take a look and see how these shape out. This is pretty similar to a lot of the other maps. Again, very similar. And then the Big 12 here, a little bit different there with Georgia Tech, but that's in many ways good. It kind of bridges that northern and southern part of the eastern flank of the conference. But where things get really dicey in this scenario is, as they always do, what if the conferences continue to expand to 24 teams? So with the Big Ten expanding even further, I think they swoop up Miami, so they're not there to go to the Big 12 this time, unfortunately. They just fit too well with what the Big Ten wants to do strategically with their expansion. And then along with UNC, I think they go and get their Duke and UVA, who seem to be great fits for the conference. And again, as always, they go and get Notre Dame because they're growing so much and they feel like they've got to join a conference while they can. Then the SEC still gets into Virginia and North Carolina. And again, I think that's a way to unshackle UNC and NC State. And then they get Clemson because they're a big brand. And then they go after those Big 12 schools again. And in this scenario, to fill in that last remaining spot, I went with Texas Tech. Now, again, it could be Louisville. I really do not think it'll be Georgia Tech, but they do have some options. But I put Texas Tech. Texas is a big state. It would be great to have another school there. Also, I've heard rumblings of Texas A&M being upset with Texas being added, that it's possible they could leave and they could try to join the Big Ten. Now, I don't know if that will or won't happen. I didn't really cover those potential outcomes in this video, but so that's another way that that Texas Tech could end up in the SEC. But in this case, we'll just put them there. And then the Big 12, I mean, first let's take a look at these conferences. Here's how they look, very similar. And this is what the Big 12 would be left with. And it is just not great. It's similar to those other scenarios, losing just even one more of its existing members. And I just really would find it hard to believe that the Big 12 would stay together after this. They would most likely separate into smaller, more regional conferences. So this is the way I see some of the most popular realignment scenarios in the case of the collapse of the ACC playing out. But let me reiterate, I am not saying that these are the only scenarios or that these are the most likely scenarios. These are the ones that are most talked about, and I game them out based on the information that is out there. And I am not saying that this is exactly how it will play out. Obviously, one little detail could change all of this completely, and I'm sure there's lots and lots that myself, as well as everyone else in the public, are not aware of. But the point that I'm trying to illustrate with all this is no matter how exactly it plays out, that is going to be very difficult for the Big 12 to make up any ground on the Big 2, especially if they expand big enough. Then the Big 12 is going to be in very big trouble and get picked apart. And then it is going to be at risk of falling apart or just being cobbled together with a lot of different schools from G5 and from wherever, just to remain a conference. So that's more of the point that I'm trying to illustrate. But I want to hear what you have to say. What do you think are the most likely scenarios, and how do you think, if and when the ACC collapses, where do you think all of the schools will go? Let me know that in the comments. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Again, we're going to start bringing more and more realignment content, especially as we head into the off season. So please subscribe and come check us out for the rest of that content. As always, go Cougs!